Okay, got it. So let's go. Hello everyone, thanks for inviting me. So today I wanted to present you some of my doctoral research on monumental tomb in Turkey, in Hierapolis. And firstly, I would like to share with you some observation about the burial archaeology in Asia Minor. Asia Minor, Turkey, benefits from large advantages, such as a long tradition of monumental architecture and inscription studies. So there is a lot of studies of stylistic, symbolic, or technical kinds. But nevertheless, the burial practices are very less well known than in the western part of the Roman Empire for several reasons. Firstly, there is unfortunately a lot of lootings and spolia, or ancient looting, or even contemporary looting. This is the first and the main problem, but there is also no attention paid to the reconstruction of the burial arrangements around the dead. I mean, the depositional context, the mode of burials, the reconstruction of perishable containers, for instance, and it's even more problematic for collective graves, which are more complex to study. Furthermore, the biological studies are not always connected to the archaeological issues, and sometimes anthropologists, bioarchaeologists, and archaeologists don't really work together. And furthermore, there is no exhaustive excavation on necropolis with a theoretical frame or comparative approach. And finally, the studies are very focused on urban sites and not always. There is no very much examples of rural funerary space. So during my PhD, I tried to answer to this to few of these gaps. Alors, Hierapolis is situated in the ancient province of Phrygia, here in black on the map, near the current city of Denizli, and it is settled on a plateau bordering the valley of Lycos, a tributary of Meander River. Okay. Alors, you have here a painting from a reconstruction of the city. Hierapolis is situated on this plateau, is bordered by the on the three sides by hills, and was established during the 3rd century BC because of thermal springs and of an associated Ctonian cult. And the Hellenistic city developed rapidly in the Roman period. In late antiquity and in the early Byzantine period, several earthquakes damaged Hierapolis. Nevertheless, Hierapolis was still an important center of pilgrimage because of the presence of the tomb of Saint Philip. And the city was finally progressively abandoned during the 12th or the 13th century. As it was a custom during antiquity, the funeral spaces were situated outside the habitat spaces. And okay, and you have 4 main necropolis: the North Necropolis, who led to the cities of Sardis and Tripolis; the South Necropolis, who led to Laodicea and Colosseum; and on the slopes surrounding the city, there were the Northeast Necropolis and the Southeast Necropolis. So here are the few characteristics of the Roman period necropolis of Asia Minor. There is many rocket tombs, and who bring a monumental environment, a monumental framework to the city. There is a lot of vast necropolis were mainly composed of sarcophagi and monumental tombs, such as tumuli or temple-style tombs. And one of the particularities of Hierapolis were the bomos, these tombs with flat ceiling. The tombs were organized in complexes. You have one complex here, for instance, another one here, with a wall around burial chamber and sarcophagi. But because there is not always a systematic excavation around the tombs, we don't really know the function of some structure. And as sarcophagi were added little by little, often we don't really know which sarcophagi belongs or not to one complexes. And some sarcophagi were put in evidence, were lighted by some platform called the bomoi or bomos. There is many inscriptions. There's many inscriptions on the Roman tombs, but generally they have no or little bibliographical elements on the owner of these tombs. The burial right was not guaranteed by the family relationships. It is assigned, and the location of the burial inside the tomb can be specified and is generally in accordance with the family hierarchy. For instance, the head of the family and his or her immediate family was buried on the upper level than the distant family, the traptoys, that is to say the adopted children, the freedmen, and the slave. And here, for instance, on the photo, you have the door of a funeral complex, and the owner chose to put his sarcophagus above this door. Generally, the inscriptions are quite vague of the description of the property. And finally, they are ended by the fines in case of non-authorized burial. Alors, the tomb which interests us today is tomb 163D. It is situated in the North Necropolis and is oriented more or less north-south with the entrance of the upper chamber in the south. So this is the chamber here in blue. This tomb belongs to a funeral complex consisting of one bomos, this sarcophagus on a platform, several sarcophagi resting on low platform, and small chambers with unclear functions. According to the architecture, three phases could be distinguished. The first one from the 1st century AD with the bomos, a platform for sarcophagi, and the tomb 163D. Later, during the 3rd century, a chamber in purple here was built. And at the end, finally, at the end of the 3rd century, 2 more chambers in green were added. And you can see in these 2 photos the complex during the excavation or the renovation. Okay. The tomb is rectangular, so I don't know why, but I don't see the photo here. But at least you can see the drawing. So the tomb 163D is a rectangular saddle-roofed house-shaped tomb building itself. It is built in travertine ashlar masonry and raised on a high podium here, and crowned by the saddle roof. The tomb has 2 chambers, the upper chamber and the lower chamber. The lower one was partially subterranean and dug in the bedrock. This is the bedrock. Both chambers have travertine benches along 3 walls as the normal Asia Minor fashion. And furthermore, the upper room has notches in the walls used as support for second row of elevated benches, but which are not preserved today, because actually the upper chamber was found empty. Its facade is decorated by finely carved lion bones at its corners, surmounted by simple corner pilasters and boasting a large and central door opening with finely profiled jambs and lintel. As we will see later, it was built during the Augustan period, and it has 3 inscriptions. The first being here, the second here, and the third on this side. So I will take a few minutes to read the inscriptions. So the first inscription can be translated as the Arun, so the tomb, this kind of tomb, with the room situated below, and the area all around belongs to Aurelia Quadratia, to Or Markelos, to Aurelia Pyronis, and to Aurelia Jewish. It is thus specified that the owners possessed not only the tomb, but also the space all around. As it is often the case in Hierapolis, it is a common property because this tomb belongs to a group of 4 people. The first owner to be named, Aurelia Quadratia, is a woman. Actually, historians consider indeed that the Jewish woman had a certain financial independence and played a more active role in the public life of the family than it was the case for the non-Jewish women. The shape of the letters, but especially the onomastic Aurelia, allow us to date the inscription to the 3rd century AD, most probably after 212 AD, when the Constitutio Antoniana gave the Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the Roman Empire, and many adopted the family name of Emperor Caracalla Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. So, 2 centuries after the construction of the tomb, an inscription is thus engraved on the monument. The shape of the letters sweep away the possibility that the mentioned persons are the original owners, whose memory, in this case, should have survived for 2 centuries before being engraved on the stone. So it is therefore unlikely that these inscriptions thus reflect a purchase of the tomb. And as the first occupiers of the tomb, we have no epigraphic information on them, about them. The second inscription, less complete, less classic, was on the block immediately below the first inscriptions and can be read as follows here. The writing is slightly different, but it is impossible to date it precisely. The mention of Aurelia Quadratia sons and the expanded access to the grave demonstrates that the inscription is later than the first one, and certainly within a rather lapse of time, not more than 1 or 2 generations. 2 new males are named, Doros and Justus, while a number of individuals are mentioned under the terms of their sons. It seems logical to assume that Aurelia Quadratia sons also were Jewish, but it is not certain that Doros and Justus, as well as sons, were also Jewish. And as you can see at the end of the inscriptions, the last part threatens with fines to anyone who exceeds access right or who would violate the grave. Finally, a third inscription is situated on the west wall above the entrance of the lower chamber. A candelabrum with 9 branches, I think, is represented, below which are engraved 3 letters. And these 3 letters correspond to the abbreviation of blessing. It is very frequent in Jewish inscriptions, and neither the Hanukkah or these 3 single letters can be dated, but it is known that the representation of the symbolic candelabrum is particularly common in the Greco-Roman world from the end of the 2nd century AD. So let's enter in the lower chamber now. This room was only discovered 20 years ago, actually, during the renovation of the monuments. The chamber was closed by a thick and sub-rectangular slab of travertine. The chamber measured approximately 3 meters by 3 meters and had 3 benches against the walls. When the archaeologists entered for the first time in this room, it was full of non-disturbed bones and soil. Some of the bones were in anatomical connections and appear as easily identified skeletons, but most of them were discolored. The outer edge of the benches and the center of the east bench were covered by just 1 layer of scattered bones, but up against the wall, the deposits were 30 centimeters thick. And in addition, the floor here in the central space and under the benches was covered with a 20 to 50 thick layer of soil and was also filled of bones. So with this exceptional discovery, many questions were raised, as you can assume. Firstly, how long have been the period of use of the tomb? Because we know the dating of the inscription, but we don't really know how long the tomb were used during late antiquity. How many individuals have been buried in the lower chamber? Because of course, few individuals are named in the inscriptions, but the tombs are quite big, so we wanted to know how many individuals eventually were buried. Who was the people buried in the lower space? Of course, no namely, but we wanted to know their composition by sex and age. If it corresponds with the family demography, for instance. Is a social hierarchy visible through archaeological evidence? As according to the inscription, we have the privileged group on the upper chamber and the less privileged people in the lower chamber. What have been the burial practices and treatment of the dead? And also how the funeral space has been managed over the time. So I excavate most part of this chamber, and I wanted to explain you a little bit the constraint of this kind of excavation. The first excavation took place in 2003 by an English anthropologist named Trevor Henderson, who excaved the blue parts, so the north and the south benches. But the distributed bones were not localized, and the biological study could not be completed. So when I arrived in 2010, I felt necessary to improve the procedure. But I had a little time, only 2 months each summer, with a post-excavation study, including in laboratory. And the space is very narrow, with a particular problem to access to the archaeological layers under the benches, as there was less than 20 centimeters in some areas between the deposit and the lower surface of the benches. So we decided to record the skeletons in anatomical connection as a single stratigraphical unit, making in the same time observation of taphonomical particularities in accordance with the archeothanatological procedure, while we recorded the heaps of bones in artificial units. But each bone was numerated and identified. With a geographical information system, each bone is precisely localized in the tomb and can be linked to a semantic data, for instance, anthropological recording. But as we didn't have really the access under the benches, we did an exception for the dislocated bones under the benches. We used a grid, and here the scale is a square. So now I will describe you the deposit. Alors. First, I tried to define the chronological frame of the occupation of this tomb. But as it is often the case in collective graves, for several reasons, it has not been an easy task to establish the chronology of the deposits. This is first of all due to the continuous reorganization of the deposits, including datable objects and the mixture of the soils, but also the complex interweaving of skeletons, the absence of sediment in some areas, and so as the lack of stratigraphy in some areas. Radiocarbon analyses were taken of some selected articulating skeletons, but because of poor bone conservation, only 13 samples gave a dating. They all come from skeletons from the south and north benches, even if the skeleton overflows to the east bench. So there is a poor representativity of the area and a poor accuracy. But according to the radiocarbon data with 2 sigma calibrated, the depositions, we know that the depositions range from 27 BC to 604 AD in date. 7 of the C13 dates reveal that the grave was still in use during the 6th century. And 2 skeletons resting directly on the benches are clearly previous to the Jewish purchase of the tomb. The C30 radiocarbon date mixed with the dating of 105 objects in a complex stratigraphical scheme, such as this one, allow us to establish 3 phases for both the area on the benches and under the benches. The oldest phases date from the Augustan period up to the end of the 3rd century AD. Then the intermediate phases date from the 2nd to the middle of the 3rd century, and the late phases begins to the end of the 3rd century. So it was a much more longer occupation than we first expected. We can also notice from now that there is no hiatus between the first occupant and the Jewish group. I try to resume the occupation of the chamber on this slide. I hope it won't be too heavy. So during the first phases on the benches, we had the first deceased on the 3 benches. Under the benches, the first occupiers made the first heaps of bones against the wall and in the corner under the benches. Okay, but near the central space, first bodies are piled up. On the central space, there is nothing. Later, in the intermediate phases, they began to remove some skeletons, in particular on the north benches, and the deposit on the remains the bodies of the 2nd occupants. Under the benches, they filled the space with heaps of bones, and also they continue to put some funerary deposits. In the central space, they firstly deposited some dislocated bones and then some bodies. Finally, during the late phases, they pursue to deposit some bodies on the north and south benches, but on the bottom bench, the east benches, they put only dislocated bones. Under the benches and the central space, it's much more difficult for us to perceive what they did during these last phases, because we have no terminus post-quem. And we believe that they only fill the space with only dislocated bones. And eventually, there is no evidence for the definitive sealing of the chamber, unfortunately. But just to say that there is no definitive date of use of the grave, but the end of its use seems to correspond with a transitional period at Hierapolis, when the necropolises are abandoned for cemeteries next to the Christian churches. So now I will describe the primary deposits that we discovered among dislocated bones. There were numerous articulated skeletons. In all, we found 123 skeletons. But for our analysis, it was first of all necessary to distinguish the primary deposit from the deposit in secondary position, which was done by observing the labial joints of the skeletons and the maintained anatomical logics. In some articulated segments, including only 2 or 3 bones, it was sometimes difficult or even impossible to determine with any certainty the nature of the deposit. So in the end, 67 skeletons were identified as primary deposits and allow us to reconstruct the burial arrangement. And as we just saw it, these primary deposits come from all phases and were put in all areas apart from the space against the wall under the benches. The dead were deposed on their back, then 20% of them were on the stomach. This number is comparable to other Roman burial contexts. The position of the forearms was most of the time along the body or placed on the abdomen, while the lower limbs were always fully extended, not bent or crossed. The deposition followed the orientation of the bench on or under which the individual was placed, but there was no standard orientation, or some bodies were even arranged so that the head of one skeleton lay next to the toes of the another one. Some skeletons show some disturbance due to the decomposition of skeletons underlying new deposition, as for example, the arm of one skeleton which fell into the rib cage of the underlying skeleton when the thorax of this last skeleton collapsed under the weight of the upper skeleton. These kinds of disturbance, as well as the shift of anatomical parts from a taphonomical point of view, demonstrate where that the deposit of the dead body could happen in a short period of time. Despite this kind of disturbance, we were able to highlight the presence of wooden containers for almost 40 skeletons. The most convincing signs were detachment of some anatomical parts due to the decomposition of underlying planks. For instance, here you have the shoulders and the right parts of the rib cage who slipped away in this direction, while the left lower limb slipped away in another direction. We had also regularly some lateral constraints, such as strongly constructed shoulders. And furthermore, we had an impressive number of nails. Some of them were almost 10 centimeters long, and some iron brackets carrying traces of oxidized wood, suggesting that these containers were nailed. At the same time, on the north bench, 2 skeletons from a late phase presented taphonomical features which cannot be due to rigid containers, but rather to soft ones, such as textile or mats. For instance, on this skeleton, we reconstruct that he was deposited with the legs straightened against the wall, and the legs fall eventually. A special coffin has been identified thanks to many small bones engraved pieces, such as vases, disc, or even a Victoria statuette. According to the style, compared to the examples known in Asia Minor, Greece, Israel, and Egypt, this furniture could date from the beginning of the 2nd century. Even if the fragments were found scattered, we can assume that this luxurious container was originally deposited in the central space of the tomb. Besides the quasi-exclusive inhumation practice, there were some burnt remains scattered in the chamber. You can see here the number by square. But most of them rested in a limited space under the east benches, the bench, and constitute an individualized deposit without a non-perishable container. These remains belong to an adult of non-determinate sex and could date from one of the oldest phases. Surprisingly, there were not many deposits in secondary deposition where bones from the same individual could have been grouped. A particular case is the quite complex skeleton of the baby whom bones have been gathered against a step in the central space. We found this kind of secondary deposits, 8 in total, in all areas and for all phases, and it shows that gradually, more than the individuality of the dead, the most important for the people who manage this grave seemed to reorganize the space to make more room for the new burials. Moreover, the composition and the localization of heaps of bones revealed that the heaps of dislocated bones were constituted in function of the bone's size. In the less accessible parts of the chamber and on the east bench, so the bottom bench, the large bones, such as crania, hips bones, were preferentially placed. On the contrary, the small bones, such as hand bones or cervical vertebrae, were basically more in the central space, certainly after being swept away during the reorganization of the skeletons on the benches. The bones numbering shows another representation of the large bones, so it looks not likely that the burial chamber went through one or several emptying. The deficit of small bones could come from conservation issues. One 1,260 objects or fragments of objects have been recorded. Most of them date from the first phases, from the Augustan period, but some goes to the 3rd century. So it appears that it is the first occupiers who mainly deposed objects with the deceased, even if some artifacts were late. If we can wonder if this scarcity was related to the Jewish traditions, some tombs in Israel show that funeral goods were present in tombs. So it might be more due to a general tendency to deposit less objects during the late antiquity, actually. We have two kinds of objects. Those used for the funeral rituals, and maybe some of them were collective. And yes, so such as small vases and pottery or lamps, they were clearly used during funerals. But we have also personal effects of the disease. We have several objects linked to the adornments, like gold thread for the precious textile found on crania, for instance, hairpins, earrings, rings, beads, or shoes, who enable us to suppose that the diseases were dressed up for the funerals. Some personal objects related to game, others related to magic protection, to textile crafts or cosmetics, which we could not attribute them to some skeleton in particular, because once again, the object and the bones were very scattered. So it was not possible to detect also a correlation with the biological sex. However, through other Roman contexts, we knew that bullae, this kind of small penance, were for children, to protect the children, while objects related to textile craft and cosmetic palettes are considered as more feminine objects. And now the composition by sex and by age. We counted a minimum number of individuals of 293 individuals on this tiny and cramped burial chamber. The difficulty to study decomposition by sex and by age is that our analysis is based on the minimum number of individuals, which does not represent accurately the real population. Of course, as I mentioned, we have a few state of conservation issues, as some areas are very poorly preserved. And as other studies in anthropology, we cannot sometimes do a distinction between older adolescents and young adults. Despite of these difficulties, we try to characterize the immature population. We had 102 immature for 182 adult subjects, firstly. So the representativity of children and adolescents is 34.8%, which is a little bit lower to a theoretical mortality for an archaic mortality. And as you can see on the chart here, the gray represents this theoretical mortality, and the line, the number of the different age group. And while the other age group are quite normal, standard, there is a deficit of the age group of the first year. About the aged population, we had a proportion of young adults and compared to the rest of aged population within the theoretical norms. But as we used method of age estimation with quite a large age group, there is too much overlaps to discuss in further details the age distribution in the adult populations. As for the sex ratio, we were able only to determine the sex on 28 male for 30 females. So as far as we know, it is conformed to a theoretical sex ratio. But despite the low numbers, there is a representativity in both sexes in every phase. So with all these results, there is no abnormalities identified in this adult population. So in this slide, there is a lot of conclusions, so it's a little bit heavy too. Firstly, the large presence of funerary deposits demonstrated that the chamber was not used as a nursery or depends on the upper chamber on its functioning. There was for every zone area in the grave many skeletons fully articulated, who demonstrate that the depositions were not simultaneous and that the dead body were brought as fresh corpses and independently of the upper chamber. There was no particular burial treatment depending on the chronological phases, just maybe with the exception with the less frequent deposit of funeral goods. There is no particular treatment according biological identity, as many skeletons were buried in coffins, for instance. And despite the change of owners, despite of the arrival of a Jewish group, we can observe a persistence of a certain chaîne opératoire over the time. It's always a little bit the same organization of the skeletons, with the loss of individuality and the importance given to pragmatical considerations over individuality. There is also no evidence in favor of a social hierarchy, with two particular cases, however, the luxurious coffin and the cremation that I presented before. And actually, there is no detectable distinction between the two groups who occupied the tomb. I mean, without the inscription, we could probably not detect second group, the Jewish group, and we can wonder if there were actually other later groups in the latest phases of occupation without inscriptions. The access according sex and age are quite compliant with an archaic mortality and with a family demography, excluding the age of 0 to 1 year, which are almost absent from the burial chamber. More than conservation problems, I think that it's a cultural choice because we have many examples in Roman antiquity of infantile burials around monumental tombs or funeral spaces only reserved for these little babies. And the first time, as far as I know, that this cultural choice is put in evidence in Asia Minor, and that we have this precious idea of how a monumental tomb was managed over the time with so many deposits and with a proximity of different religious groups, because we often had this idea that the Jewish people could not be buried in the same tomb that pagan people, and these work show exactly the contrary and show all the significant participation of the Jewish community in the organization and the evolution of the funeral landscape in Hierapolis. I thank you for your attention. And I also would like to thank all these people in this last slide who allow us to bring this study to this presentation today. Thank you.